company was better known for three-wheelers and the sort of cars that British comedy had turned into national shorthand. Then there's the Rover P6 3500S. If you grew up in Britain during the 1970s, he was a young motoring journalist trying to make a living writing about cars he often couldn't afford. Speed approaching 150 miles per hour, and a rear wing so enormous it looked as though somebody had accidentally fitted part of a touring car to a family Ford. The car you remember most isn't always the fastest, it isn't always the rarest, and it certainly isn't always the most expensive. To understand why, you have to go back to a very different Britain. The Midlands of the late 1960s was a place of factories, rain, brickwork, and machine oil. British industry was everywhere, and in West Bromwich, a small company called Jensen Motors was attempting something slightly mad. They wanted to build a grand tourer that looked as though it had arrived from Italy while being powered by something considerably more American. That car became the Jensen Interceptor. Its body came from the Vignale studio in Turin, with a long bonnet, a dramatic glass rear section, and proportions that somehow made the car look fast while sitting completely still. But the rear glass was more than a styling exercise. It was enormous. A single curved piece wrapping around the back of the car, almost like the canopy of an aircraft. For a small British manufacturer, producing that glass consistently was an engineering nightmare. And then there was the engine. A huge Chrysler V8 sat beneath all that Italian-looking bodywork, delivering more than enough power to make the car feel considerably less refined than its appearance suggested. That contradiction was the whole point. Elegant outside, brutal underneath, and British reliability somewhere between the two. For Clarkson, the Interceptor arrived at a very different stage of life. He was not yet the television personality millions would eventually recognize. He was a young motoring journalist trying to make a living writing about cars he often couldn't afford. Fuel mattered, rent mattered, invoices mattered, and yet somehow the Interceptor became one of those cars that made practical thinking temporarily disappear. Because an Interceptor didn't simply accelerate, it arrived. The V8 thundered forward while the exhaust filled the road with a sound that had no business coming from something wearing such a sophisticated suit. Inside there was polished wood, thick leather, and enough old-fashioned luxury to make you feel wealthy, even if your bank account strongly disagreed. Then came the electrical system. And this was where British engineering reminded everyone that beauty has consequences. The heater apparently had two settings, nothing and the surface of the sun. Windows could develop opinions of their own. Fuel gauges were sometimes more optimistic than accurate, and sitting in one on a warm summer day could feel less like driving and more like volunteering for an experiment in human endurance. But that was part of its character. People who owned cars like this didn't just remember the good bits. They remembered the smells, the electrical failures, the strange noises, and the negotiations required to get everything working again. Clarkson eventually let his Interceptor go. And that is where the first important lesson appears. When you're young, the things you love can look replaceable. There is always another car, another opportunity, another check that needs cashing. You don't yet understand that some things only become irreplaceable after you've lost them. Then comes a car that, on paper, sounds almost like a joke. The Reliant Scimitar GTE. Reliant was not exactly the sort of name that made people imagine exotic performance. The company was better known for three-wheelers and the sort of cars that British comedy had turned into national shorthand. But the Scimitar was different. Very different. It was one of the earliest genuinely practical sporting estates, combining the shape of a family load lugger with the attitude of a sports car. There was room for luggage. There was room for dogs. There was even enough room to disappear for a weekend without having to choose which possessions were staying behind. And underneath it sat a Ford V6 capable of taking the car to 60 miles per hour in roughly 9 seconds. For the 1970s, that was serious pace. But the cleverest part wasn't the engine, it was the body. Reliant used glass-reinforced plastic instead of conventional steel, GRP. The same basic material the company had already learned to work with in other products was turned into the body of a surprisingly elegant performance estate. It wouldn't rust in the same way steel would. It was relatively light, and it allowed a small manufacturer to produce something ambitious without taking on the enormous manufacturing burden that came with conventional metal construction. The joke, really, was that the company everyone associated with strange little three-wheelers had quietly built something rather clever, and Britain eventually noticed. Princess Anne owned several scimitars during the 1970s and 1980s, giving the car an endorsement that no advertising department could have manufactured quite as effectively. For a while, the supposedly unfashionable Reliant was about as fashionable as a British estate car could become. Clarkson's connection with the scimitar fits perfectly with the broader pattern. The cars that mattered weren't necessarily the ones with the most prestigious badge. They were the ones with an idea behind them. A clever solution. A bit of character. Something you couldn't simply reproduce by throwing more money at the problem. And that's something many enthusiasts eventually discover themselves. You can buy a newer car. You can buy a faster car. You can even buy a more expensive car. But that doesn't mean you'll love it more. Then there's the Rover P6 3500S. If you grew up in Britain during the 1970s, you probably knew the P6 before you ever knew what a performance car was. It was respectable, sensible. A car for people who owned good coats and listened to Radio 4. It looked like the automotive equivalent of a well-made wool jumper. Nothing flashy. Nothing desperate for attention. And then Rover did something wonderfully unreasonable. They put an aluminium V8 into it. The engine had originally come from Buick in America, where the lightweight design had failed to become the success it might have deserved. Rover saw something different. They saw an opportunity. The result was the P6 3500S. From the outside, it still looked like the sensible Rover your neighbor might drive to the shops. Underneath, it had enough muscle to make considerably sportier cars uncomfortable at traffic lights. That was the magic of it. You could drive past someone looking completely respectable and then put your foot down and remind them that appearances are occasionally a terrible guide to what is happening underneath the bonnet. Even the interior had its own personality. A single-spoke steering wheel, warm wood, deep cloth seats, old-fashioned switches, the unmistakable smell of a 70s British car after years of use. If you have ever sat inside one, you know that smell. And if you haven't, there are some things photographs simply cannot communicate. That is why old cars can be dangerous to fall in love with. They don't just store memories, they manufacture them. A particular smell can take someone back 40 years in an instant. A particular engine note can put them back on the same road, in the same seat, with the same person beside them. And that is probably why a car like the P6 mattered to a young Clarkson. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't need to be. It was clever, quick enough, comfortable, and unmistakably British. Before the supercars came along, this was the kind of machinery that taught people what cars could feel like. And then we arrive at the car that creates the most painful kind of regret. The one you almost bought. The Ford Sierra Cosworth. This wasn't simply a fast version of an ordinary Ford. It existed because Ford wanted to go racing. Motorsport regulations required road-going examples to be produced before the racing version could compete. So Ford needed thousands of them. And rather than treat those road cars as an inconvenient necessity, Ford turned the requirement into an opportunity. They built something outrageous, a turbocharged 2-liter engine, more than 200 horsepower, a top speed approaching 150 miles per hour, and a rear wing so enormous it looked as though somebody had accidentally fitted part of a touring car to a family Ford. The wing wasn't merely decoration. It had a genuine aerodynamic purpose. But it also told every other driver on the road exactly what sort of afternoon you were planning to have. The problem was that everyone else noticed too. The Cosworth became one of Britain's most notoriously stolen cars. Owning one could mean waking up in the morning and wondering whether the car would still be sitting outside. It wasn't merely transportation, it was a risk. And Clarkson, by then working seriously as a motoring journalist, came close to buying one. This is where the story becomes painfully familiar. He talked himself out of it. Mortgage, family, practicality. The sensible voice that occasionally appears in your head, just when you're about to do something you'll remember for the rest of your life. He listened to that voice. And decades later, that decision looked very different. A genuine, good-condition Sierra RS Cosworth can now command a price that would have seemed absurd when these cars were simply fast Fords. The exact figure depends heavily on specification, condition, and history, but the broader point is brutally simple. The car became valuable, much more valuable, and the sensible decision became the expensive one. That is the kind of regret almost every enthusiast understands. Maybe it wasn't a Cosworth. Maybe it was a motorcycle, a house, a watch, a camera, something you looked at and thought, I could buy that. Then you decided not to. And years later, you see one again and realize the version of you who made that decision had no idea what was coming. That's the cruel thing about hindsight. It gives you perfect information at precisely the moment when you can no longer use it. But the Cosworth still isn't the car that matters most in this story. That comes next. Because one car wasn't merely something Clarkson nearly owned. He actually owned it. He loved it. And eventually he sold it. The Jaguar E-Type. Before the television career, before the fame, before Clarkson became the man whose opinion could move an audience, he was simply a young journalist trying to build a life around his obsession with cars. And somehow, in the early 1980s, he ended up with a 1965 Jaguar E-Type Series 1. British racing green, long bonnet, beautiful proportions. The kind of car that makes you stop talking for a moment when you first see it. Even Enzo Ferrari famously praised the E-Type's beauty. And you can understand why. The E-Type didn't look designed so much as sculpted. The bonnet seemed to stretch forever. The cabin sat far back. The wire wheels looked almost delicate against the length of the body. And when the engine came alive, the whole experience changed. Imagine an early morning on a British B-road. Mist still sitting low over the hedgerows. The road almost empty. The straight six warming beneath the bonnet. Leather and warm oil inside the cabin. The car moving through the bends while the scenery slides past the windscreen. That is what gets lost when people reduce an old car to its auction price. You don't remember the auction estimate. You remember the morning. You remember the road. You remember who you were when you drove it. And Clarkson's E-Type was not some untouchable museum object. It was a car he actually used. That matters. Because cars become part of your life when you use them. They carry you somewhere. They break down somewhere. They make you late. They make you laugh. They give you stories you couldn't have planned. But in 1983, life presented Clarkson with a very ordinary problem. He needed a house deposit. The E-Type was valuable. The house was more important. So he sold it. At the time, it made perfect sense. That is what makes the ending so painful. Nobody needs a time machine to understand the decision. A young man needs somewhere to live. An old sports car is an old sports car. You sell the thing you can live without. Except the E-Type didn't keep behaving like an ordinary old car. Its value went in the opposite direction. Decade after decade, good Series 1 examples became increasingly desirable. Today, a well-preserved example can be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, with exceptional cars reaching considerably more. So the car Clarkson sold to help buy his first home eventually became worth many times what it had been worth when he let it go. Financially, that hurts. But money isn't really the painful part. Because if it were simply about money, the story would have an easy ending. Buy another one. Clarkson can afford it now. He could probably find a better one, a cleaner one, a more valuable one. He could put it somewhere warm, surround it with everything an E-Type could possibly need, and look at it whenever he wanted. But it wouldn't be that car. It wouldn't be the green car. It wouldn't be the road. It wouldn't be the younger version of himself sitting behind that steering wheel. And that's the thing people misunderstand about collecting. You can replace an object. You cannot replace the moment attached to it. That's why someone can own a garage full of cars and still talk about the one they sold decades ago. The expensive cars aren't necessarily the important ones. Sometimes the important one was the car you could barely afford. The car that arrived before the money, before the fame, before anyone cared what you thought. The car you bought because you loved it, not because owning it made sense. And perhaps that's why these 5 cars tell a much bigger story than the simple list suggests. The Jensen Interceptor represented the reckless enthusiasm of youth. The Scimitar showed that clever engineering could beat prestige. The Rover P6 proved that something ordinary-looking could hide something extraordinary. The Cosworth became the car that almost happened. And the E-Type became the one that actually did. The one that stayed, even after it was gone. Because eventually, every enthusiast learns the same uncomfortable lesson. The car you remember most isn't always the fastest, it isn't always the rarest, and it certainly isn't always the most expensive. Sometimes it's simply the one that belonged to a particular version of you. The version with less money, less certainty, more time. The version who could take a car out early in the morning just because the weather looked good and there was an empty road waiting. That version of you disappears eventually. The car just happens to be what reminds you that he existed. And that is why the E-Type matters. Not because it became a £250,000 car. Not because Ferrari's founder supposedly admired it. Not because it now sits in a completely different financial universe. It matters because Clarkson had it when it meant something different. Back then, loving cars cost him money. Later, loving cars became his career. There is a difference. The first is passion. The second is a profession built around remembering the first. So these aren't really 5 cars from Jeremy Clarkson's past. They're 5 reminders of how quickly life changes. A grand tourer that mixed Italian elegance with an American V8. A plastic-bodied estate that quietly embarrassed the stereotypes surrounding its manufacturer. A respectable Rover with a hooligan hidden underneath. A Cosworth that got away because being sensible seemed like the right thing to do. And an E-Type that was sold for a house deposit before anyone knew just how much it would one day be worth. And perhaps that's the most honest definition of a great car. Not the number on the speedometer, not the number on the auction sheet. The number of years later that you can still remember exactly how it felt. Because you can buy horsepower, you can buy leather, you can buy rarity, you can even buy another E-Type, but you cannot buy back the morning you spent driving the first one, and you certainly can't buy back the person you were when you did. So now I'm curious about your story. Was there a car you once owned that you wish you had never sold? Or perhaps one you could have bought, but decided to leave behind because being sensible seemed more important at the time? Tell me what it was in the comments. Because somewhere out there, someone else probably made exactly the same decision. And if you enjoyed this kind of story, subscribe for more forgotten cars, strange pieces of motoring history, and the machines that meant far more to their owners than their price tags ever suggested. Because sometimes the car you regret losing isn't the one that was worth the most. It's the one you didn't realize you were going to miss.